evokes foot movement, and stimulation laterally along the central sulcus evokes face muscle and tongue movements. And stimulation in between those areas evokes hand movement, arm movement. So that's how the body map was created, and as you can see, it is distorted. So the more space is allotted to the body parts that to the proximal musculature and tongues and lips, rather than to the distal musculature. Body parts that have the largest cortical representations are capable of more refined movements. So our speech takes up a lot of different movements, and of course our fingers, like index fingers, have a lot of functions. So also those body parts have the lowest electrical threshold for evoking movements. So I thought that's interesting, useful for TMS. Fibers originating from primary motor cortex terminate in intermediate zone and ventral horn of the spinal cord, but I'll go later into spinal cord. So right now I want to concentrate on primary motor cortex. Motor cortex receives various inputs from different parts of the brain. For example, supplementary motor area, premotor areas, basal ganglia and cerebellum have inputs into motor cortex through the ventrolateral nucleus of thalamus. Posterior parietal area gives input to motor cortex. And finally, somatosensory cortex also gives input to the motor cortex. And cells located slightly rostrally in the motor cortex are activated by the kinesthetic input, which is the input from muscles and joints, which is like the feedback from muscles and joints. And cells that are located caudally in the motor cortex are activated by cutaneous input, which is the feedback from skin. So the purpose of those inputs is the adjusting and directing of the movement. So I also thought it's very important to remember that the motor cortex has the input from somatosensory cortex, because when we activate peripheral nerve with electrical stimulation, we activate the efferent fibers, and so they project to the somatosensory cortex, and it somehow modulates the motor cortex activity.
Can I ask a question? Did you get that information from that paper, Strick 2006?
No. It was from lecture of Dr. Strick.
In 2006?
Yeah, that was the lecture from 2006. Mm-hmm. So, the lecture is still running in the program, so I just took this information from there. Mm-hmm. One very important question to ask is whether one controls movements or individual muscles, and the answer to that is it's both. So there are single output neurons in motor cortex that control several related muscles, and that might reflect the possibility that a single neuron may be involved in the generating of pattern of muscle activity. There are cases when the groups of output neurons that innervate single muscle are located in different regions, are clustered in one region. So the single muscle can be represented in small areas of motor cortex. Also, there are also the same muscle can be activated by multiple areas in the cortex, and that might reflect this multiple representation might reflect the multiple use of a muscle. So I told you about like how the groups of neurons related to the movements, to the individual muscles. And now I want to tell you about how a single neuron relates to the movement. So if we record from motor cortex, from primary motor cortex, there are a big diversity of different neurons that relate, that are responsible for different aspects of the movements. For example, there are neurons that are active before the movement is started, so they're responsible for initiation. And there are neurons that are active when the movement is during the movement. So, also, there are neurons that seem to be particularly active. They're active during all types of movements, not only voluntarily movements. And there are neurons that are particularly active to the dynamic changes, like, for example, change in force or change in directions. Let's see. There are also neurons that show enhanced activity during one particular preferred direction of the movement. So as we can see, there is a big diversity. And motor cortex is really fascinating. And I would like to move from motor cortex now to its primary tract that originates from it. It's corticospinal tract. It has two divisions, lateral corticospinal tract and ventral or anterior corticospinal tract. And it's very important for manual dexterity, so for those refined movements. About 50% of the corticospinal tract originates from primary motor cortex, from layer 5 neurons. And according to one study, around 10% of the cells in this area, layer 5, primary motor cortex, are called bed cells. Bed cells are the largest cells in the neural system, and they have very, very long axons, so that you can imagine that but one axon of bed cell can go from the primary motor cortex up to toe. So that's, not to up to toe, but to the spinal neural, yeah. So that's the example of bed cell. The picture, it has very, very long axons and apical dendrites and all kind of dendrites. Also, besides primary motor cortex, corticospinal tract fibers originate from other areas like premotor cortex, SMA, supplementary motor area, primary somatosensory cortex, and posterior parietal cortex. So here I decided to trace the axons, how they go from primary motor cortex to the spinal cord. And so the fibers go the fibers from motor cortex go through internal capsulate, and here axons that influence upper body are located anteriorly, and axons that influence lower part of the body, they run posteriorly. At the level of midbrain, corticospinal tract forms the most of the cerebral peduncles, and at the level of cerebral peduncles, the map is rotated so that now the upper part of the body is located medially, and lower part of the body is located laterally. And when the corticospinal tract enters pons, the fibers split, and they are located within pontine nuclei. That's at the ventral pons. At caudal pons, they reunite and enter medulla in the form of medullary pyramids. Here. at the junctions of brainstem and spinal cord, 90% of the fibers cross to the opposite side. This crossing is called pyramidal decussation. So now, those fibers...
So before you go there, so we stimulate usually on the pyramid, so very close to the pyramidal decussation, the corticospinal tract. So what will be the location there then for the fibers that control upper limb movements compared to the location of the fibers that control lower limb movements?
I think once the map has rotated to in midbrain, and fibers run upper body runs medially and lower body runs laterally, I don't think it changes anyhow. It just runs in the same way.
So then, say it again. So which?
Upper body runs medially.
When you say upper body, means the arm.
Yes, yes. And lower body runs laterally. So
which one will be more superficial on the surface? If you have the brain, think about the person. This is the head. Can you try?
Yeah.
And then we see, or maybe on an. Okay. We have two electrodes here, or we have the coil. So if you think about the location, which fibers we should activate first?
I think.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. According to what I said, that would be lower limbs, because they are lateral. But that doesn't make sense to me. That because when we stimulate, the arms are activated more than legs, right? So
we usually get, when you are stimulating the cervical medullary junction, we get the arm before the leg, especially the biceps, even before the hand muscles. So maybe you can check.
I'll make sure that I said.
And you can tell us next week.
Okay.
Very accurate information, because this is very important. It's very interesting. So apart from where, is the shift, that one is more medial and one is more laterally, but relate that to the anatomy. And if you think about the person here, and you will stimulate in the midbrain or the cervical medullary junction, which what we can do, which fibers will you target first? Maybe the threshold is different, okay? And maybe that's why we get one before the other one. But it will be very nice if you clarify that.
Yes, I will.
And you tell us, next week we don't have too many presentations, so it will take only a few minutes, but that will be very relevant for us. Okay?
Sure. I don't have to write it down for recording. So, but it made sense from what I said. My suggestion was from what I've learned, so that would make sense, but it doesn't really, because we see different results.
I guess it depends on what you call lateral and medial. It depends on your presentation. I mean, in that order, what will be, if we have the spinal cord like this, and this is the head of the person, are you thinking lateral this way and medial this way?
Yes, okay. And that's exactly how even like